as you can hear, this presentation will be recorded for any folks who can't drop in right now or who would like to review the presentation later, so just keep that in mind. So, thank you all for tuning in, and welcome to our webinar on PJM's Fuel Security Report with considerations for state advocates and policymakers. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, so if you have anything, feel free to enter something into the little chat on the side, or if we're transitioning and you have anything you want to bring up, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask Tom or Casey any questions. So, welcome. I am your moderator, Ashley, and your presenters are Casey Roberts from Sierra Club and Tom Rutigliano from NRDC. Okay.
All right, great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. This is Casey Roberts from Sierra Club, and thanks, Ashley, for getting us started, and to everyone for joining or who's listening to the recording later. So my name is Casey Roberts. I'm a senior attorney at the Sierra Club, and I'm just going to start out the presentation with a bit of background on how we got to this point, to put the PJM analysis regarding fuel security in context. There's undoubtedly some even older context, but I'm going to start in 2014 when we had the polar vortex event that involved some extremely cold temperatures and a really high forced outage rate among PJM capacity resources of about 22%. And a forced outage is basically when a generator has to shut down or isn't able to start up when PJM asks them to for unplanned reasons. So during the polar vortex, about a quarter of that 22% outage rate was related to the lack of fuel at gas-fired plants. The other 3/4 of those outages were due to problems like instrumentation freezing or coal piles freezing, things like that, but a quarter of it was related to lack of fuel. And the lack of fuel in the case of the polar vortex was not the result of pipeline disruptions so far as we know, but simply the higher demand for gas for building heating, which obviously goes up during a severe cold snap. And heating uses of gas take priority over electric generation uses in almost all circumstances, given the public safety implications. And not all gas suppliers have firm supply contracts or backup fuel on site. So that lack of firm gas supply for many gas generators, as well as the potential for multiple gas generators to be affected by a single pipeline disruption, is what PJM and others generally mean when they talk about fuel security. And I find that term to set up a potential bias in itself, because it suggests that what we need is firm fuel supply or on-site fuel storage, when what we really need is generators who are not vulnerable to fuel disruptions, and fuel-free resources such as renewables and demand response are just as capable under those circumstances as fuel secure ones. Nevertheless, I'll be using the term fuel security in this discussion as sort of a shorthand for the problem that PJM is trying to address. So just to keep that in mind, that we try to be conscious of sort of the bias created by that term fuel security at the same time as we're using the term. So for all the attention that the polar vortex gets, it is worth reiterating that no power was lost as a result of the high forced outage rate. The polar vortex did, however, precipitate a lot of discussions and policy changes. PJM initiated several non-market reforms, like requiring generators to follow weatherization checklist going into each winter season and improving gas-electric coordination. PJM also changed its capacity market rules to require all generators to be available year-round and at any time that they're called. This was a new construct known as capacity performance, and it introduced important accountability measures for capacity resources, but also unfortunately eliminated seasonal capacity products that had allowed greater participation by demand response and renewable energy. In late 2017 and early 2018, you may remember there was another cold weather event across a large portion of the eastern US, which was known as the bomb cyclone, or less alarmingly, just the cold snap. And PJM also did some analysis of the forced outage rates and causes from that event, and we saw that the forced outage rate was about half of what it was during the polar vortex, but lack of gas supply still accounted for just under a quarter of those forced outages. And finally, I note that PJM continues to add a lot of gas capacity, and that appears to be the trend for the foreseeable future. So if in fact there is a problem related to fuel security, gas availability, which is far from established, that problem is going to persist and perhaps even grow given those trends and capacity additions. Next slide, please, Tom. So how do we get here more immediately? Well, the Department of Energy's proposed grid resiliency pricing rule in fall 2017 was really when fuel security first assumed the now prominent position that it has in the energy policy world. As you may remember, that rule, the NOPR, would have offered cost of service payments to any generator with 90 days of fuel on site. And while it wasn't exactly clear who that encompassed, since many coal plants don't even have that much fuel, it was pretty clearly intended to exclude gas generators unless they had football fields worth of backup oil on site to burn and were capable of burning that as a backup fuel. The NOPR suggested that over-reliance on a vulnerable gas pipeline system had rendered our grid system not resilient, and the NOPR portrayed the polar vortex as a crisis solely deriving from gas delivery disruptions. PJM vigorously opposed the NOPR and set forth a pretty comprehensive record that its system was in fact resilient to gas pipeline disruptions. They outlined many of the reforms that had been taken in PJM since the polar vortex, including the introduction of capacity performance. PJM argued that everything was fine, and basically there was no need for this dramatic measure. In January 2018, FERC rejected the NOPR, but did open a proceeding that's still pending today to examine the resilience of the grid, and fuel security issues are certainly within the scope of that proceeding, though it is a bit broader, looking at sort of other threats to the resilience of the grid. Meanwhile, you have actors like Murray Energy and First Energy Solutions continuing a campaign sort of badgering FERC and the grid operators about what they were doing or not doing relating to preserving so-called fuel-secure baseload generation. And at the same time, ISO New England is undertaking a process to evaluate the ability of its system to provide energy during winter events, given the various possible disruptions that could occur to its either energy imports or fuel imports. And ISO New England did end up in a situation where they determined they had basically an emergency relating to fuel security, and that they did not have time to implement a market-based measure to address it. And so they were stuck with, in their mind, and FERC agreed, an out-of-market solution, basically offering reliability must-run payments to specific so-called fuel-secure resources. So that is all going on at this time, and clearly creating a lot of pressure, intense pressure for PJM to show that it was proactively addressing alleged fuel security problems. If you could go to the next slide, please, Tom. So in April 2018, PJM announced that it was going to undertake a very focused study of fuel security in its territory. And at that time, PJM released a 6-page preview called Valuing Fuel Security, setting out its intended analysis. And PJM not only explained that the goal of the study would be to understand fuel supply risks, but also suggested that once it had identified areas where additional fuel secure resources were needed, it was going to model that as a constraint in the capacity market and basically develop a market-based mechanism to compensate for fuel security attributes through the capacity market. And when asked why capacity performance, which it had only recently implemented, did not address the issue, that is why it didn't create sufficient penalties for generators that aren't able to generate power during winter emergency events, PJM said that this new study was intended to address more of common mode failures like pipeline disruptions that are outside of a generator's ability to control or plan for. Over the summer and early fall of 2018, PJM shared a few updates with its stakeholders on the scope of the study and its key assumptions, and they also did outreach to different industry groups to gather data that was not publicly available, like information about oil truck refueling. For the most part, though, PJM held its cards pretty close to its chest and did push back the release date several times. Finally, in November of 2018, the results were released, and PJM did a pretty comprehensive sort of communications rollout of those results, which basically showed there was no imminent problem. And then in December 2018, the full report was released. including technical appendices and a lot of very interesting analysis. And PJM has announced that it is going to begin the stakeholder process to sort of address whatever fuel security problems may exist and better define that problem this month. So we'll talk about that a little bit more after we get into the meat of the report. And then just one thing to flag here, the question marks on the bottom of this slide. PJM has made clear that it is going to do further analysis of the ability of its system to respond to pipeline outages suggested by DOE, basically those that might relate from malicious acts as opposed to sort of the more routine, for lack of a better word, pipeline disruptions that PJM has seen in the past and which were the kind that it evaluated in this report. So we do not know when that analysis might come out. And PJM has also made very clear to stakeholders that the underlying information, sort of what type of pipeline outages related to national security might occur and where they might occur and exactly what the consequences would be, may very well not be public. Not even all PJM staff may be able to see it. So that could come out in the next year easily, and is sort of concerning for that lack of transparency. But I will go ahead and turn it over to Tom to talk about the substance of the report.
Thank you, Casey. This is Ashley. Just wanted to check in and see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop something into the chat. We'll also be taking questions at the end of this webinar. And for folks who are just tuning in, please keep in mind that this is being recorded for people who aren't able to watch right now or who want to access this presentation later. All right, do we have any questions? All right, let's hand it over to Tom.
You may be muted, Tom.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I'm sorry, I apologize for the mute error there. So I'm Tom Ritigliano, advocate with the NRDC, and I'll spend the next few minutes going through an overview of how PJM did its report and what conclusions it's reached. Overall, they approached this in the same way as many other planning issues. Basically, they took a look at what they think the demand for power might be and investigated the odds that there would not be enough supply to meet that. So the slide you have up in front of you, which is a schematic, but generally to scale, shows essentially the interaction between demand, the blue line on the bottom, and supply, the red line on the top, going from normal operations on the left with ever more extreme conditions as you move to the right. So talking through this, PJM starts with what you might call a normal winter peak, the load you would expect the average winter to about hit, or half the winters to be worse than. They plan to something a little more severe than that, what they might call the 1 in 10 year weather, which is, as the name suggests, the severity of load you'd expect in one winter every 10 years, so a moderately severe winter. That gets you your supply line down at the bottom, sort of one step up from normal operations. Then on the supply side, they start with, at least in this study, the supply that's in place now with expected retirements and new generation that's made it to a certain point in the process. Now, of the generation that's running, at any time you expect about 6% or so of it to not be working just for various mechanical or maintenance issues, and that's the normal outage rate. On top of that, what they found in the winter is that outage rate tends to about double, generally due to cold weather issues, and you drop that down to get to this high outage rate. One thing that's interesting about the study, PJM advanced their modeling of winter generation outages in this just for mechanical reasons, not due to fuel. And it turns out that one of the more important factors is what they're calling outliers, which are generators that have unusually high winter outage rates. and that it appears from your technical appendices that about 80% of the additional winter outage rate is due to the top quartile of generators. So to some degree, that's maybe indicating resource-specific maintenance problems. But in any event, that combination of a high outage rate and 1 in 10-year weather is basically the current planning criteria. And again, as you can see by the green arrow, there's quite a large safety margin in PJM now, often something in the neighborhood of the high 20s or 30% excess generation. So during what you might call routine operations and no special planning, the system is more than adequately supplied. So now in the course of the study, PJM began making things a little tougher. First, they went with more extreme weather. They took what they were calling the 1 in 20-year cold snap, and then extended that for the longest duration of any cold snap they've had in the last 45 years. So it was a 2-week period with weather equal to as cold as it's supposed to be in 1 in 20 years. So that gets you the more extreme weather, which again, compared to a normal winter, is about twice as bad as the 1 in 10-year current planning standard. On top of that, then they added pipeline failures. Now, this is an interesting one because in a lot of the discussions, people were talking about sort of national security pipeline failures, whether it would be a terrorist attack or a cyber attack or something along those lines. But the actual pipeline failures modeled in the study were a lot more mundane, or at least they were consistent with a maintenance problem or a construction mistake, something along those lines, which apparently, according to the report, happened with some frequency, about twice a year or so in PJM. So it's not excessively dramatic pipeline failures that they're looking at. And under their model, when a pipeline was out of service, it would be out for 5 days and then potentially on limited duty for another week or so after that. But it turned out that pipeline failures really had a pretty low impact. Again, the steps on these lines are indicatively to scale of how important each factor was. And in themselves, pipeline failures did not create any reliability issues. They then moved on to the next level, which was examining fuel supply to specific plants. Now, plants can take their gas service as either firm or non-firm. And again, as the name suggests, firm gas service means they've paid to have gas delivered under all circumstances, whereas non-firm service can be interrupted for higher priority users. In the winter, that may be other plants with firm service or residential heating loads, for instance, but non-firm plants basically have interruptible service. And PJM took away the non-firm service in 2 steps. First, they took away about 3/8 of the non-firm service. So they said that there's some degree of interruptions or shortage in the gas system. And then they went to the next level and took away all of the firm gas, all of the non-firm service, so that only plants who had firm service receive fuel. And those 2 steps were far and away what created the problem. Basically, plants, when you went from any plant that was willing to pay for gas to get it to only those who had reserved it ahead of time is really when you saw the largest drop in capability in the system. And then finally, on top of that, they limited the amount of oil trucks that could make it to the plants. Many of the gas-fired plants in PJM are what they call dual fueled. So if gas is not available, they can burn oil. The typical plant has tanks on site to support it for about 3 days, and after that need fuel trucks. What PJM has observed during previous winter events is that there simply cannot be enough fuel trucks to go around sometimes, that these winter snaps are when oil is going to be in high demand, again, for many other heating uses in addition to power plants, and some days there just weren't trucks. Again, important to realize that this is a fairly mundane limit on trucks. It's not, as I think some people have read the report, indicating winter weather so extreme that the roads are closed for 2 weeks. It's just merely an estimate, PJM's estimate of how often the trucks can get to the site. And that in itself had something of an impact. On its own, not too much, but when combined with the gas outages, is really what ultimately would lead to power being out. And then finally, PJM limited the amount of imports they would expect to get from other RTOs by a small amount. I'm not sure if that's material or not, but it was a little step down. So anyway, even after those 5 or 6 contingencies beyond what we currently plan for, there was still a sizable gap between the expected load under very extreme weather conditions and available power. So as PJM concluded, the grid as it stands now is reliable even under the most extreme plausible circumstances they could think of. So then the study began to push further. In the study documents, they're clear that they're considering this a stress test, in a sense, seeing where the system breaks, similar to the load limit 15-ton sign you might see on a bridge or something like that. Although there's a slight bit of back and forth, because parts of the document refer to this as simply a stress test, and other parts describe these as extreme but plausible scenarios. So as to anticipate the policy discussion a bit, exactly how plausible these scenarios are will be, I think, cause of some discussion. Are they forecasts or are they just thought experiments? In any event, what PJM did is took the current supply and looked at different high retirement paces. In one case, they assumed that 15.6 gigawatts of additional coal and nuclear plants retired, which they said was driven by looking at the economics of those plants with input from the industries. And then in another scenario, they assumed that 32.2 gigawatts, so quite a bit of those plants retired, but that new generation, mostly gas with a little bit of renewables, replaced them. In both scenarios, after their retirements, PJM had themselves at the bare lowest reserve margin. So again, generally to scale, you can see where they went from the current supply down to the hypothetical supply line in red. And then they performed the same analysis with all those same outages cascading through. I'll note that in their retirement scenarios, the system was much more dependent on gas. So the pipeline failure and especially the firm gas and oil truck shortage contingencies had a greater effect. And so what they found is that once some of the non-firm gas is unavailable, you begin to see, if everything else goes wrong, some problems and localized problems. And that once non-firm gas is cut off entirely, you start seeing much more significant problems. The oil truck shortage issue doesn't create problems initially, but as the tanks get burned down towards the second week of the problem, you begin to see more extended outages due to some plants simply not having fuel to burn. So that essentially was the so-called problem scenario, or the fuel insecure scenario that PJM got us to. And we can summarize the findings of that. They ran about 380 different scenarios, which are largely just all the different permutations on the outages I described here. This graph is simplified, but for instance, for the pipeline failure, they had 5 different examples and so on. So out of all those scenarios, what they got to was first and foremost, under both current and foreseen conditions, there is no fuel security problem, right? Both with all of the current retirements that are in the queue, the most extreme weather they could come up with, and a long list of contingencies, the system still operates as expected. So that in itself is a full stop. But then when you go into hypothetical scenarios with large amounts of coal and nuclear retirements, you begin to see some vulnerability to gas disruption. The sub-takeaways under that is that the problem is almost entirely gas plants without firm fuel contracts. Of all of the cases where they had some loss of load, what the industry refers to as a blackout, all of them except one happened when all non-firm gas was shut off. There was one case where a partial shutoff in non-firm fuel and everything else could cause a small localized blackout, but otherwise it was entirely due to all of the non-firm fuel being shut off. On top of that, I believe you needed to have some degree of truck shortage. The report did not present cases where there was no shortage of fuel trucks. They presented a moderate and an extreme fuel truck shortage case. If you had the case with the full gas outages and the very short of trucks case, you start getting blackouts, that should say day 5 or 6 of a record-breaking cold snap, which is when all the on-site fuel is gone. And then the final surprise takeaway is that the pipeline outages were really a very small player in this. In themselves, the pipeline outages never caused any loss of load or voltage reductions. And pipeline outages on top of the non-firm fuel being pulled back tended to make things worse, but was not as dramatic as you might have expected. Okay, so again, we're basically looking at contracts and trucking of the power plants being what the identified issue is. Now, when they looked at the outages, PJM released some detail. We would hope to see more in the future on what kinds of blackouts we would see. And from what we could tell, they were generally limited in extent, but long in duration. In all but the most extreme scenarios, the blackouts are less than 3% of the region, sometimes less than 1%. But you would see the same areas having peak hour blackouts over and over again for several days. They assumed a 2-week duration for most of the problems, and that really is what you saw. For the first 4 or 5 days, even in the most severe cases, there weren't any problems, but then things would get steadily worse. Outages in most cases were localized in the east and may even just be in a few pockets. The study doesn't give us enough data to fully examine that, but it has some hints. in the worst hours of the worst events, you begin to see some more widespread outages. But again, nothing that gets to the point of system collapse. I believe they had at one point up to 6 or 7% of the system. So it's a number of pockets in the east and several in the west in the very worst cases. So that at a high level is summarizing what we saw from PJM. I'm be happy to take any questions, and I'll turn it back to Ashley.
All right, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or pop something in the chat. As a reminder, we're also taking questions at the end of this presentation, so if you want to hold off until then, that's also great, but if anyone has any quick questions, feel free to ask them now.
Hey, Tom, this is John Mork. I've got a question for you and Casey. If you can hear me.
Fire away.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
I maybe have two. But the first one is, am I right that this study does not look at all at what changes to gas markets itself or themselves could ameliorate some of the, non-firm impacts? Because I don't think this is the same as, I don't think that the study is saying without, firm gas or that there's not enough gas in the system. It's just that if you don't have firm, you're not going to get it. But if you have firm, somebody else might not get it. I don't think the gas is always flowing even, at peak capacity during times of extreme demand. It's at least in part the sort of, limited design of the gas markets that prevents some of the price visibility during these polar vortex events.
Thanks, John. I'll take that, Casey, unless you'd like to jump in. Yeah, they didn't look specifically at gas markets or any of the price formation. So there's definitely room to explore there. I think, PJM has been pretty open that they feel better coordination between the electric and gas industry may resolve some of these problems. I believe to some extent they looked at cross-scheduling among gas plants. Again, it's hinted at in the report that if there was, not enough capacity on a given pipeline to serve all the plants, they would be willing to wind down some plants so that others in more critical locations could work. So in a sense, PJM is standing in as a proxy for, things that might come from gas industry reform. But overall, no, they did not look particularly deeply into the gas market conditions beyond whether the non-firm fuel was available or not.
Okay. And then one other question, which is on gas unit outage rates, which I know also can deteriorate over time. And it's also, from what I understand, with gas turbines in combined cycle, it's hard in these extreme conditions to get them below to below a specific outage rate, and then again they get worse over time. But I think what you're saying is that even with extreme outage rates due to the mechanics of the system itself or for reasons other than fuel supply, that's not itself going to be a significant impact. I'm just looking at normal versus high outage rate. It's not, it's obviously an impact, but it's not as significant as non-firm gas unavailable.
Yeah, that's correct, John. The step was about 6,000 megawatts between the normal and high outage rate, which did include some modeling of failure to start, especially when a dual fuel unit is burning oil. Apparently that's fairly common that they have a hard time turning on that way. So the issue was, though, that high outage rate was baked into all of the scenarios. So we don't have any visibility into whether backing out that high outage rate would have reduced the problem or not. Again, something I'd hope to see from PJM. But overall, it's 6,000 megawatts is the excess outage that they're predicting due to non-fuel but weather-related issues.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions for right now? All right. If not, then let's move on to the next section.
All right. Thanks, Ashley. This is Casey again. So although PJM study shows there is no imminent risk, PJM has made very clear that it intends to immediately start a stakeholder process to develop mechanisms to forestall the development of any problem in the future. And one thing, going to the question that John just asked, is they do talk about those non-market measures they want to implement, basically to improve, they say, improve the shared understanding of pipeline and grid operations and how they interface, collaboration with the natural gas industry to increase transparency of the secondary gas market, and some measures like that to basically give PJM greater visibility in what's happening there and perhaps sort of make that market work a little bit better, that gas supply market. But turning back to kind of what's within PJM's direct control is whether they want to make any changes to their own wholesale markets in order to address this problem. And PJM is undoubtedly watching how this issue has unfolded in ISO New England, where, as I mentioned, ISO New England found itself, in its view, we did disagree with that, got somewhat flat-footed by its own problem and had to rush into implementing a non-market or out-of-market measure to address those issues. And so PJM does not want to find itself in the same situation. They're trying to get ahead of the problem that they view as existing. And so we wanted to just provide a little bit of an overview of what that stakeholder process basically looks like at PJM, because we think it's really important for states and consumer advocates and environmental advocates to be engaged in discussions about the issue, and at least sort of follow it through that process so that if something does go to FERC, we will, folks will be better situated to respond to it. So the first step is for PJM, what they do is they introduce a problem statement at the Markets and Reliability Committee, or the MRC, which is one of the major standing committees at PJM. And PJM has said that it's going to do that at the January 24th meeting, which is coming right up. And the problem statement is intended to be a clear statement of the problem to be addressed, issues to be resolved, or an opportunity to be seized, as the case may be. And the way that issues are framed in that problem statement obviously sets the tone for the group's work. For example, does the problem statement that might be introduced here leave open the possibility that the task force created to work on it might find there's no problem at this time that needs to be addressed? Or does it assume there's a problem that needs to be addressed and leave only to that group identifying what the solution should be? All right, so that will be really important with this particular topic. The next step is for the MRC will develop an issue charge, which has much more detailed information about the technical issues and policy issues to be addressed by this task force, who will have responsibility, what other PJM experts should be involved, and expected deliverables and overall duration of work. And that's a major unknown right now. Is PJM has said that it wants to file something at FERC in early 2020 to basically implement a market-based solution to either resolve the problem or prevent it from developing, but we don't really know within the next year what the timing is going to look like. So the problem statement and the issue charge basically go to guiding the work of a task force that will be created. And then that task force will adopt a charter that sets out its own planned work products and deadlines in more detail. And one thing that's important to note is that anybody can participate in that task force, even if you're not a PJM member. There's an email list you can sign up for, and meetings are posted ahead of time. Folks can call in or attend the meetings in person and present information or even your own proposal. You won't be able to necessarily vote if you're not a PJM member, but you can be part of the discussions and listen in and learn quite a bit about the positions of different parties and the different technical information that is available. Then at some point, that task force will formally vote on the different measures before it and then pass that recommendation, or if they weren't able to reach agreement, a suite of proposals back up to the Markets and Reliability Committee. Then the MRC will vote on it, but it's important to remember, unfortunately, that the PJM Board of Directors is really who decides what PJM will file at FERC. And they prefer to file something at FERC that reflects agreement among stakeholders, but they don't have to. And so the stakeholder process is extremely important to engage in, but it is not the be-all, end-all of what PJM will do. So I think, unless there's any questions, I'll turn it back over to Tom to talk through some of the the different advocacy points and major issues that we'll face in this stakeholder process.
Do we have any questions for Casey right now? All right, let's move it back over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And you could just confirm I'm off mute.
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks. So high level, we see roughly about 5 things that could come out of the stakeholder process. Of course, people's imagination is unlimited, but just in terms of the discussions we're hearing on where this might go. One quite likely outcome, for better or worse, is simply no consensus. The PJM stakeholder process lately has shown a tendency towards gridlock. So it's quite possible that no proposal is able to get a sufficient amount of support to be approved by stakeholders. There needs to be a 2/3 majority ultimately approving anything to go through. That's the case that the board is most likely to act on their own. We've seen in a number of cases where stakeholders don't reach consensus, but PJM staff feels action is required. The board will quite frequently act on staff recommendations. So if stakeholders get to nothing, it's probably going to be the PJM staff solution, maybe colored slightly. A different outcome than no consensus is if the stakeholders affirmatively decide to do nothing. To the extent of deciding that this issue is either too theoretical or there's no real need to change or it's best dealt with outside of PJM. But there could be any number of ways where the stakeholders do take a vote and essentially tell the board we would like you to do nothing. As Casey mentioned, there could be some cases where the board would act in that procedure, but that would be unknown territory for the PJM stakeholder process for the boards to actually override the stakeholders rather than filling a void left by the stakeholders. Now, if stakeholders do decide to take one of, some more affirmative action than that, the 3 outcomes we could see, the first would be the traditional reliability must run contract, which is actually already in the tariff, so might just need a little bit of tuning. The idea being that if there are particular generators that PJM judges their retirement will cause a reliability problem, PJM can enter into contracts with that generator, which will generally be some kind of cost recovery contract. Those are one-off. I don't believe they're public, and it's traditionally how PJM has dealt with localized reliability problems. You saw a few of them in northern New Jersey over the years, but they're not very commonly used. Going towards more general market-based solutions, which is what PJM has publicly stated they would prefer, one option would be to create some sort of a tribute called fuel security and begin paying resources that could provide that something extra during the winter. Exactly how that might look is up to debate. There's word that that's the favorite approach of PJM staff. The main issues with this would be defining essentially a technology neutral definition of what fuel security means. And I would note that this solution, I think, probably tends to be inherently biased towards generation solutions and against more demand side or transmission options. But again, it does at least, it's pretty clear, and it does at least create a revenue stream that some would feel would perhaps delay unwanted retirements or incent development of new resources. Beyond the carrot, the other approach is basically the stick, which is to limit or place additional requirements on your generators that are at risk, right? That could take a number of forms. Could, for instance, say that you need to have a firm fuel contract to be capacity performance, additional requirements on fuel trucks, and so on. There's any number of ways that PJM in the past has dealt with resources that too many of them create a problem, even if none of the individual ones do. So roughly speaking, you've got those 2 types of market-based solutions, the carrot of fuel security payments or the stick of limits on the at-risk units. So as we delve into this, I'll hit a couple of just the different considerations I think people might want to think about as they're entering the problem. The first seemingly obvious, though, is what problem are we trying to solve, right? PJM has presented what I would characterize as a thought experiment showing that, there are some possible futures where fuel security becomes an issue. I think we have to very much be on guard about what is meant as an illustrative example, or at least I've taken as an illustrative example, being turned into a planning scenario. The difference being that there's no real assessment of the likelihood of the scenario PJM came up with occurring, how that compares to other scenarios, what makes the scenario they came up with more worthy of attention than one that someone else might come up with. And similarly, there's discussions we really need to make about how robust we want the grid to be and what types of stress we actually want to be able to withstand. Back on the beginning slides, we mentioned that we currently plan the grid to survive the 1 in 10-year event, right? This is currently updating it far past that. They've got a 1 in 25-year weather event combined with a number of contingencies of unknown frequency. So we're dealing more towards a once-in-a-century problem, perhaps here, or even further out. Do we actually want to buy that level of reliability? Is that worthwhile? In the background, too, is what kind of threats we need to prepare for. The threat of hostile action, we'll call it, terrorism, cybersecurity, and so on, is in the background of all of this. It's less explicitly part of PJM's study than I think is commonly thought. But there's no doubt that part of this discussion will be what sorts of things, other than simply accidents, mechanical failures, and so on, are we trying to get ready for? But with none of those pinned down, it's going to be very difficult to make good policy simply on the basis of the scenario PJM has shown us. We also need to figure out if PJM is actually the right entity to address this problem. Clearly they would like to take market-based solutions to procure this fuel security attribute or prevent fuel insecurity. But there are certainly other ways of doing it. One that may be front and center is that the PJM retirement study did not take into account the state policy support for nuclear plants we've seen. I believe there's at least 3 nuclear power plants in PJM that were forecast to be retired in PJM's study for economic reasons that may survive due to state economic incentives they're getting. So it may well be that state action has actually solved this problem already. We simply don't know and need more information. Similarly, if the risks do turn to be localized, it may turn out that states are the most appropriate ones to solve it. If a given region of the state is at risk, that could be seen as a distribution issue that the states could solve with distributed resources or demand side measures or so on. So again, we want to see, is PJM the right one to solve this? Do they need to on their own? Who's going to set the reliability standards? We also, I believe, need to take a close look at whether the existing frameworks, especially capacity performance, do address this. As Casey mentioned earlier, capacity performance is meant to solve, or at least to make sure generation owners have responsibility for everything their plants can feasibly deal with. And this study was at least started on the idea that it was studying problems that individual plant owners could not solve through money. But what it has found is that the problem is actually fuel contracts and availability of trucks, both of which seemingly probably can be solved by sufficient application of money. So it's not as clear as we might have hoped, or indeed as some people have presented, that this is not merely an individual power plant owner issue that they should be expected to solve under their capacity performance obligations. And even if it's not, this study has not looked at how much money will be flowing through capacity performance. Some of you may recall capacity performance puts penalties in the order of $3,000 or $4,000 per megawatt hour during emergencies. So you're very easily looking at billions of dollars in penalties flowing from the gas plants to somebody else in a scenario as PJM looks like, and we certainly need to look at if that's sufficient incentive on its own to solve the problem. And then finally, the perennial rate-making question. If we do arrive at a solution that involves additional payments, who will be paying for them? Will it be ratepayers? Will it be the power plants who have caused the problem? Those would be the 2 most obvious candidates, but I imagine with creativity, we could come up with other people to pay also. Okay, if Ashley, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. So we have around 15 minutes to take any questions from anyone. So we had something in the chat.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Yep, go ahead.
Could someone describe the makeup of the board and on a high level, what are sort of the political dynamics that work within it?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Casey, if you'd like to answer, if not, I'll jump in.
Go for it.
Yeah, so the board, it's 10 people. The most active ones tend to be former utility executives, people just with experience at running power grids. They're also what I might call the more specialized members. They usually like to have one member with accounting and financial controls expertise, like human resources and IT and so on. But the real decision makers on this will be coming from a utility background. And I guess I'll just add specifically, there's generally not consumer advocates or environmental advocates on the board. It's still fairly much a set of industry representatives.
And one just follow up, are those utility folks, do they tend to be distribution utility former executives, or are they independent generators?
Pretty broad cross section. There's definitely some of all of them. You know, there are definitely independent generators are represented, as are distribution utilities and transmission owners.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Casey. Just to follow up in terms of the political dynamics, I think what we've seen is that PJM, the staff and the board, is incredibly motivated to preserve a very high level of reliability regardless of the cost. And we've seen that in the fact that PJM continually implements policies that overprocure capacity by a significant margin. And whether that is because of just a sort of a hyperactive concern regarding reliability without regard to the cost, or a degree of capture by the generators in the region is unclear. But I think that sort of we can see that play out here as well, especially because it is amplified by, I think, PJM's desire to prevent any heavy-handed action by the federal government, by DOE, in terms of a bailout. And PJM feels, I think, a strong desire to show that it is taking care of the problem, and that's part of why I think they're likely to perhaps overreact a bit, or to define the problem in a way that will show DOE that they are taking care of what DOE thinks is the problem. So something to keep in mind about the motivations of the different parties involved here.
Thanks, Casey. Got a question in the chat for a link to joining the PJM task force or getting notifications for the task force. Somebody have that they could drop in the chat.
It has not been created yet. The task force hasn't been, so there's not really a link right now, but I'll provide a link to the Markets and Reliability Committee meetings, and I would encourage folks who are interested in following it to register for that January 24th meeting. You do have to create a PJM account to register for the meetings, but it's not that onerous. And then if you follow that, you'll likely see news reports about this as well. You'll then see when that task force is created and be able to sign up through that. So sorry, it's a multi-step process.
Thanks, Casey. All right, does anyone else have any other questions that they want to bring up? Feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat. Any takers?
This is Casey. I'll just add one more comment, which is that in case folks are curious about sort of PJM's narrow focus on gas fuel supply delivery here, there were lots of comments to PJM that it should also be looking at coal fuel supply delivery interruptions. And PJM basically resisted expanding the scope of the study in that way, or they said they didn't have good data on it, or they thought that those fuel supply interruptions were folded into the coal plant outage rates. So there was lots of pressure on PJM to try to be a little bit more even-handed in looking how it looked at resiliency here and the different threats to it, but PJM was fairly insistent that it was going to maintain this narrow focus. So there were lots of things that were deemed to be out of scope in terms of looking at resiliency, more broadly speaking here.
What's your view as to how we have PJM take demand response and other efficiency measures more seriously as part of this review?
Tom, do you want to describe how they did account for the demand side measures in this review?
Sure. And
Starting point.
yeah, in the review as they took it, they just looked at the existing demand response in the market and forecast that forward. So they'd be looking at demand response just as it participates in the capacity market now. I think an open question as we look to solutions is if there could be another tier of demand response to deal with this problem. If we are looking at a 1 in 25 year situation, it would seem to me PJM should be pressured to look at demand response that is only called in extreme circumstances. And also, regarding energy efficiency, they have at the moment not a great track record of respecting energy efficiency in the market. So yeah, it's far from clear that they would give adequate credit to, say, winter energy efficiency things that both reduce the need for electricity and the need for natural gas. So ultimately, the way to get them to pay more attention to this is through the task force that's going to be created. That those resources would need some strong advocates there if we go down a path that they fit into.
A follow-up question from the chat is how are Casey just answered that, and Casey also dropped a link for the sign up for the Markets and Reliability Committee meeting. So if you want to check that out, feel free to follow the link and create your PJM account and sign up there. All right. And do we want to explain the summer resiliency question or?
Yeah, I can answer here as well. So the question was, how is PJM justifying not looking at summer resiliency as well? Exelon and many of the other nuclear folks actually did encourage PJM to expand its study that way, to look at also like a summer emergency event. And PJM resisted doing so. And I think that there's a couple of reasons. One is that summer is when the peak load is in PJM, and so there's already a lot of planning done to ensure that there's resources available at that peak load, whereas the winter peaks have been, I think, not as much the focus of studies. So, the idea is that there could be problems there that haven't been addressed. This whole issue of the competition between heating uses of gas and electric generation uses of gas doesn't arise in the summer. So if that's the concern, then there's really no reason to look at the summer. And then finally, I think PJM was, because part of the motivation for this was to directly respond to complaints that they were ignoring this issue of what's going to happen in the winter when there's not enough gas. They really wanted to keep the study focused on that to move that discussion forward and show that they were being responsive. So there may be other factors as well, and PJM may turn around and now do a summer study, but I think that's a lower priority for them at this time.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, so we've got time for one more question probably, or a couple quick ones. So anyone want to have the last question? All right. If no one has any more questions for now, feel free to send any of us any questions you have afterwards via email or what have you. But I think that wraps up our webinar. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And this recording will be saved and we can send it out to folks after we get the recording. Tom and Casey, thank you so much for presenting.